Hello, my name's Narajan, the host of Master of Your Crafts podcast, learning from leaders who are continuously inspired, passionate, and driven to align with their soul purpose, sharing their gifts to bring healing to others. The music is composed by Rebecca Everett. Today is episode number 40, and I'll be talking to Eric Schneider, who is a licensed mental health counselor and PhD candidate in human sexuality. He is a kink and poly-friendly therapist who is mainly focused on sexuality, relationships, men, gay, straight, bi, etc., and those who love them. Eric is and has been a practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan and various Taoist meditation practices and other martial arts for over 50 years. He is also a musician, a mildly aspiring stand-up comic and ventriloquist. He lives in New York City with his partner, dog, and bird. Hello and welcome to Eric. How are you, Eric?
I'm well, thanks.
Eric, I'm curious in what you have experienced, because I know you are a psychotherapist, a counselor, and you support other people on their own emotional journey of where they've been and what's plaguing them and what's challenging them and what's not and what's completely okay just to be as you are. How did you come to that process? Because I know you've had a fair bit of journey yourself, not only from living in certain parts of the world and being exposed to different, I want to say modalities or thought principles. How has that led you into who you are today?
Those are always tough questions, and always worth sort of the inquiry for me, because the construction of a narrative, like right now in the utterances of the narrative, I have to recollect, remember, reconsider, right?
Yeah.
And sort of reconstruct and then share, right? Or utter out of my mouth, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I'm in the habit of saying that the story of me is not me, except where it might be me. So given that framework, there's the way that I organize that information in a particular narrative, and I preface this by saying a narrative is never complete, right? But I've come to feel over my life experience, my life course, for lack of a better term, that I was very fortunate very early on, being the age that I am, living in New York City, and New York City being a mecca for all of those spiritual traditions, from Buddhism to Taoism to various forms of martial arts here for the first time, like Aikido and Tai Chi came here in the 60s, a little bit before, but really became popularized in the 60s. Ramakrishna Vivekananda Center here in New York with Swamiyata Swarananda. I mean, these traditions were really taking root here with people who were really steeped in those traditions. And I was very, very fortunate with my parents in many ways, and in some ways, like most parents, not so fortunate. But in terms of my parents' encouragement to explore, that was something that I definitely was given, and a great deal of permission and encouragement to follow my curiosity about things. And I was fascinated by these Eastern religions as well as Western religions. I was from Brooklyn, kind of venturing into other spaces and other kinds of places, and being exposed to and curious about these kinds of traditions. A lot of them resonated with me and felt very much like, oh, I want to do this. I want to participate in this. And so it took me into Aikido, it took me into Tai Chi Chuan, it took me into other Taoist arts and meditations and things like that. and also their philosophies. And these were small little communities. So, like, very early on, exposed to, as a consequence of practicing Aikido, meeting certain people who were then doing other kinds of things, and sort of
Right.
the expansion and exposure of all of that. A big turning point for me was in the early 80s, during the height of the AIDS crisis. I had not determined what my career path would be at that point,
Mhm.
but was very moved and very called by what was happening, the AIDS epidemic and the gay community, and the gay community with respect to the local and federal governments, and what was being done, what wasn't being done. And I knew I wanted to do something. There was a book I read actually after this period. It was called Callings, and it mentioned, it had a phrase in it that really struck me, which was, when you don't heed a calling, it becomes an inner nag. And
Mm.
that was what was happening. It was like I was trying to resist that calling, but I couldn't resist that calling anymore.
Right.
And in New York at that time, there were two subgroups. One was ACT UP, which was very engaged in the political fight and the democratization of available drugs. And in the background of that, of course, there was this other movement by Louise Hay and Marianne Williamson around the psychospirituality of dis-ease and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And Marianne had, with the help of a number of people, started the Manhattan Center for Living. And I came in there in my young, arrogant, full of my own experiences, listening to someone, kind of quoting the Course in Miracles in high performativity,
Wow.
coming in once a month and then leaving. And then the aftermath of that was really challenging, because it was not thoughtful, it was not considered, it was a misuse of spiritual principles in the face of horrific experiences and
Mm.
a lot of misinformation. Not much different than COVID, actually,
Right.
in terms of the quackism and the don't worry about it, all this kind of stuff that sort of
Okay.
came out of that, not much different, actually, in a weird
Okay.
way. And so that actually was not very different. One of the differences now was how quickly, people moved into action and how quickly we got some science around it. But at that time, it was a very precarious time period. So there was no passing if you were HIV positive. If it
Mhm.
moved to AIDS, you were starting to get these opportunist infections, Kaposi sarcoma, which was the purple lesions, muscle wasting. And so, sort of watching an entire group of people, an entire culture,
Yeah.
be decimated by a disease process left me in a very interesting, kind of precarious context. We had spiritual people saying this was how it is, and me going, it's not how it is. These are not cause and effects, right? From my understanding, when it comes to things like karma, we're not in a vacuum. We're never going to understand all the causes and effects and whatnot. So there was no point in even going down that fork in the road. When it came to ideas about what I used to call cognitive magic tricks, Marion once said to someone, and it was heartbreaking. Someone was sharing in one of the rooms where she was leading, and they said, my boyfriend just passed away and I'm really heartbroken. And her response was, just pretend your boyfriend moved to China. You wouldn't see him there anyhow. And I get the kind of analogy, kind of like, okay, we transition, we're in a
Mhm.
different place, whatever the implication was.
Mhm.
But it was a real kind of like, not only a misattunement, but a complete lack of regard for the person's experience. And so
Yes.
what would happen is she would leave and then they would come in for crisis counseling. Now, originally, when I went to the Manhattan Center for Living, I only did it as a volunteer, but within 6 months, they made me the clinical assistant clinical director without any
Wow.
clinical experience. All I had was what I had been learning in these other traditions, these other contexts, and without the internet. So we kind of,
Mm.
we're patching together, cobbling together various kinds of understandings. And at that time, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work was very much part of the background, part of the discussion, and her stages of death and dying. These, of course, got co-opted into stages of grief and loss, and they're not the same. They're not equivalent as far as I'm
Right.
concerned.
Right.
And her stages of death and dying are also not, and she said very often, they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily happen in a particular order, but people were very much around that time kind of, oh, what, keeping the order. And why are you keeping the order? It's kind of all over the place.
Right.
So we had developed a crisis counseling model, but then things started to change, and I had not come out yet. I was still not out.
Mhm.
And at that time, it was during that time that I did come out. And as a consequence of coming out during that time, there were a lot of different experiences I had that later on in life made me examine not just the quote unquote coming out process, but what it means to come into a culture,
Mhm. Mhm.
and what that's actually like. There's a lot of research and a lot of written about coming out, and the process and the stages and all of that kind of stuff. But no one
Right.
ever talks about coming in. What is it like to come into a culture?
Mhm.
But then things started to change with the protease inhibitors, and people were self-referring to me and wanted me to be a therapist. And so I started to fill in my own education. And originally, at that time, a lot of people in New York, and still to a certain degree, a lot of people have, I'm an original New Yorker, right? And that's actually
Mhm.
a status that not a lot of people have.
Right. Yes.
To be born, bred, raised, etc., living in New York,
Yes.
is not something necessarily a lot of people have. And a lot of people come to New York not just for career advancement or opportunity that way, but at that time, a lot of gay people, gay men, were coming to New York to be able to, from the Midwest and from what we call the Bible
Mhm.
Belt here, and really took on this idea of AIDS being a punishment. The
Mhm.
wing was so opportunistic around the AIDS crisis. It was really kind of amazing.
Mm.
Many were fighting against that. This is after the 60s and gay liberation and women's rights
Yep.
and civil rights and right. Um,
Yep.
so we're still fighting for our lives in a literal way. And that kind of motivated me to go, okay, well, what am I going to study? And I didn't feel like the lens of psychology was very helpful at that time. It was a lot of hand wringing. And
Mm.
there were only a couple of institutes in New York for therapeutic training that actually allowed explicitly gay members into that realm.
Really.
So I started training at the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy with some of its founders and some of its other trainers. Um, and I came into that institute when many of the leaders of that institute had died of AIDS.
Mm.
So they were also in mourning and also exploring and also bringing tremendous amounts of, it was the first Western context in which awareness was playing a central role in exploration, examination, experimentation with being. That was my first kind of foray. But I also realized that I was very interested in theology from the vantage point of, well, why are these people, because I wasn't exposed to this too much, but why are these people just taking on this idea of God's punishment? And I realized most people, when it comes to Western religious traditions, have intermediaries, priests,
Yep.
pastors, etc. And so they're getting their relationship with the written words
Yes.
and God and spirituality all have these intermediary kinds of spaces. So I thought, let me go study that. And I did. But I realized that I wanted to be able to have meaningful conversations with people and be able to actually use text if necessary with them to explore and examine and question various beliefs that they had been imparted to them and imposed upon them. And that was very helpful. But that took me to pastoral counseling and notions of various kinds of traditions of pastoral counseling, which are usually, from the Christian tradition around finding the still voice within. But again, that's sort of the esoteric
Yep.
presentation of Christianity, not the exoteric
Yeah.
presentation of Christianity, right? When you start getting into the esoteric aspects of all of these religions, you find much more liminality, and much more room for exploration and much more room for discernment as opposed to what is handed to you. And I found this really useful.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and and from that, um, that dovetailed very nicely with my previous non-traditional educational experiences, if you will,
Yeah.
and my own becoming. And like I said, during that time, late '80s is early '90s is when I started coming out and discovering what that meant, at least at that time, and what that meant for me not living up to the hyper masculine, muscular, straight acting paradigm that had been made quite famous by Tom of Finland as an artist, and sort of something I saw as a reaction against hegemonic masculinity, which seems to be inherently femphobic. So any kind of gender performativity that isn't ascribing to a certain kind of performativity is coded in very particular ways.
Yeah.
So at that time, it was as though this division occurred between those who were men who had more feminine gender performativity as opposed to those who had more masculine gender
Right.
performativity, as a way of kind of co-opting masculinity and saying, yeah, it doesn't belong to just you straight people,
Mm.
or you straight men. And so that's where I was with all of that. And of course, I lived through the various experiences and time periods of sort of the evolution from the AIDS crisis to working with gay men, working with gay couples, working with gay couples who are discordant, right? One person being positive, one person being negative, managing the changes that were occurring with the protease inhibitors, really watching the impact of the protease inhibitors and the way in which many were like, even now, people sort of, it's very funny. Some of the parallels are really very parallel. People just chomping in the bit, waiting to get back to the life that they think they
Yeah.
miss.
Mhm.
And that was true for many gay men at that time. It was really
Yes.
about, I'm going to get back into the club scene, back into dating, back
Yeah.
into, the freedom of sexuality and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
That has also changed over time. And I've been watching it and a part of that change at the same time. And the landscape is completely different now. About 15 years ago, in really recognizing that things were changing, right? We have this idea that things are getting better, that we're making
Mhm.
progress.
Mhm.
Um, we are, except that we're not
That's
really.
right. Yes.
It's a very strange phenomena, right? I will hear very white privileged academics talking about this is all special interests, the LGBT community, women, Black Lives Matter. It's all special interests. Really, what we need to be focused on right now is climate change.
Okay.
And I keep hearing that, and I'm going, yeah, but the same causality is in place for both of those things.
Right.
I mean, we got to talk about capitalism, consumerism, greed. I mean,
Yeah.
we really need to talk about those things
Yeah.
and why people are pushing back so hard from these quote unquote special interest groups is because the air and the privilege that you have is not the air and privilege that the rest of us share.
Absolutely.
And so our voices, how our voices are sanctioned or how our voices are supported or how our voices are oppressed or repressed,
Mhm.
suppressed or supplanted or, no, let's talk about this because this is you seem to get exactly what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
So I went back to school about 11 years ago because I started to notice a trend in the gay community around more and more difficulty being expressed with the inability to not only establish relationships but maintain them.
Mm.
And we're intersecting now with technology at that point. So there is this increase in app use that I found
Yeah.
really interesting, which are now colloquially called hookup apps, right?
That's right.
And what I noticed in these hookup apps is that they were not all created equal.
Mm.
Some were really like commodified, height, weight. I mean, there are precursors to all of this with phone
Sure.
sex lines and chat lines
Sure.
and ads in newspapers. That was way back when.
Mhm.
The landscape for meeting was really changing. So, we had these neighborhoods that had bars, we had these phone sex lines, we had, but people were still meeting on the street, and so gay men engaged in cruising.
Right.
And I don't want to go through the whole history of, all right, because we'll be here for a long time, but at least with cruising, you had to make eye contact. You had to have
That's right.
a conversation. You didn't know what someone looked like underneath their clothes. So there was mystery and
Yeah.
excitement and potential. Over the last 15 years, it's more like shopping on Amazon. And
Right.
so there's greater commodification, greater male gaze, gay male gaze, greater objectification. And the interesting thing, of course, around objectification is that it's mutual, right? The more I
Mhm.
objectify the other, the more I'm objectifying myself, right?
Right.
So I'm losing my humanity in this
Yeah.
and becoming more and more of a product and a commoditization. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that's part of this issue. And I heard it from clients lamenting, oh, I met this guy, right? And so then the culture of ghosting and breadcrumb and all this stuff. So I
Mhm.
started to go, okay, I need to go back to school. When I went back to school, New York City laws changed around what constituted a licensable degree for doing psychotherapy. And so I went back to school and I got my degree. And then I started going, okay, but now I need another context for my thinking. I need to
Mhm.
really kind of explore what's happening here. Um, and of course the lenses that I had lived in were kind of narrow, the psychotherapeutic lens or the theological lens or the bridging of the theological with the psychological and the pastoral counseling lens. But I knew there was more, and I
Okay.
really wanted to be exposed to the more, and I wanted to look at things from a different lenses. And I have my own neurodiversity and my own attention deficits and my own dyslexia and my own dysgraphia and dyscalculia. I mean, I have
Mhm.
my share of neurodiversity. And so I've always found contexts to be containing. And if I put myself in the right context with the right mix of people, not only will my thinking be contained, it'll also be nurtured and amplified, and I'll get to explore more. And so that's what I did. So first I went to Widener University, which has a PhD program, an accredited PhD program in human sexuality. And I was there for a year. But as a 50-year-old man, I found it a little infantilizing, a little too constraining,
Mm.
not diversified enough in the lenses that were accessible. And so I found out that Gilbert Hurt, who is a anthropologist and one of the early researchers in sexuality outside of just Western sexuality, but in Papua New Guinea, had really started to explore sexuality in other cultures and the anthropological. And I thought, oh, he's starting this other program. Why not transfer there? And the California
Right.
Institute of Integral Studies started their own program. But when I was at Widener, it wasn't accredited yet.
Mm.
But the California Institute of Integral Studies has a history of integral yoga as its background. It has a spiritual, not necessarily as foreground, but as background. And it lends itself to things like social justice and real queer studies and feminism
Mhm.
and consciousness studies. And so, wow, okay, human sexuality program situated in all of that. Interesting.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So there was a lot that I got to be exposed to with regard to very different ways of thinking about human sexuality and consequently for me, human relationships, especially the romantic, intimate variety.
Right.
Um, and so that's kind of where I am now as a quote unquote sex and relational therapist, recognizing in my own research, which was a small group of gay men, consequently, I'm seeing the same things happen kind of across the board.
Mhm.
There are real changes taking place in our relational landscape. The role of heteronormativity has been, over the last 20 years, has been very much called into question. Its centrality, in which everything else is compared, has been called into question. Heterocentrism itself has been called into question. And what I mean by that is sort of, there are gender roles, and this is the sanctioned
Mm.
sex we can have, and this is what it's for, and and who benefits from it, and all of the misogyny inherent in it, and the femphobia, and the homophobia, and
Yeah.
all of the xenophobia that lives in that heterocentrism, including racism, actually, because it was only when were couples allowed to marry who are mixed race? That's a very new, I don't even remember
I
the
think
date of
so.
that, but that's a
Yes.
very new phenomenon.
Yes.
And that's why everybody was so surprised when one of our Supreme Court justices is anti-LGBTQ marriage. It's like, what are you talking about?
Mm.
You married a white person.
Mm.
So it's a very strange kind of phenomena. And with this, it's interesting to note for me that in my research and in looking at the literature, women having second relationships, not as interested in living with their partners because of that heterocentrism, and what comes with it, which is, where is that physical labor? Who gets to do what? Where is the
Right.
emotion work and emotion labor, and how it lands squarely on women? How that entire structure favors men, that it lends itself to unfairness, that it can barely tolerate any kind of gender role strain or difference in expectation of gender role performativity, how it locks us into things that we're human beings. Bodies
Yeah.
change, minds change, hearts
Absolutely.
change.
Yes.
That's what we are, right? So
Yeah.
when I think about even liminality, I don't think of it as a transitional space anymore. I think of our entire existence as being liminal, and relational spaces entirely liminal. And that our pursuit of trying to ensure them and force them into a box, or get guarantees of emotional safety, as much as that might be a human tendency, it's not functional. We're basically holding other people and our relationships hostage to an idealized version, often a Disneyfied version of what a relationship is, or what a relationship can be, or how we relate to it as a thing that we want to have or possess, or a place to be in, etc. So it's caused a lot of questioning even in my own work, but I have to stay focused on my dissertation and do this part of it, and then I can expand it into these other areas.
Yes. It's very interesting, just the sheer background and exposure that you have had in such an enriched community on all facets, from a humanitarian piece.
Mm,
What I'm curious about is, having gone through all that process and really delved into a lot of different aspects of who we are as human beings, the fundamentals of how we think, how we behave, how we act, how we change, all of that, what we believe, what we don't believe. Do you feel that that curiosity and that essence of that peace, whatever that is, defines you in who you are?
it drives my being, if that answers your question. Right?
Yes.
It's not an identity. With certain kinds of encouragement early on, and the freedom that my curiosity has always been given, even when I run into obstacles, I don't wear down too easily. I mean, I will
Mm-hmm.
continue to search or search out. What drives me and what nurtures me and what inspires me is this realm of curiosity and this willingness to kind of look at stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, in answer to your question, I guess we could say that, but I don't experience it as an identity as much as a energy, a force. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I don't even experience it that way. I'm too already in it to even have noticed that there was something that was pulling me or calling to me or pushing me, right?
Yes.
If that
Yes.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you feel is your calling? I know you touched on it before, earlier in the conversation
It is
about.
my calling.
Yeah.
I don't have a single calling in that sense.
Mm.
I've never resonated with the idea of purpose
Okay.
in that sense. I grew up with a calligraphy that hung in my room for many, many years. That's a judo aphorism, which is use your abilities for good purpose.
Okay.
If I had a purpose, that's my purpose.
Okay.
Whatever that looks like, whenever that looks like, wherever that might look like.
Right.
Um, I have struggled throughout my 32-year career as a psychotherapist with monikers.
Mm.
Psychotherapist, counselor, coach, educator, teacher, student, seeker, human. I've never, ever been able to land on anything
Mm.
that actually feels like it contains me
Right.
and my professional work. I've
Right.
changed my website a million times. We found each other on Clubhouse. I've changed my Clubhouse
Okay.
biography a million times.
Yeah.
I don't believe in core self. I really don't. Not in that narrative way.
Mm.
I don't, that's not my experience. I experience lots of selves,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
but not oh, this is Eric, doesn't, this is what Eric does, other people. For
Exactly.
years, I was in groups with therapists. Well, Eric's a Buddhist. And I'd be sitting there going, "I'm not
Right.
someone else would go, Eric's like a Taoist. I'm not.
Right. Right.
In many of these contexts, I've always felt like a kind of an intimate outsider and not really like, an appreciator, an intimate
Mm-hmm.
outsider, a dabbler,
Mm-hmm.
rather than a professional who devotes 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to the thing that that's their thing.
Yeah.
um
Okay.
that's not me. I've devoted a lot of time to a few very important things that are important
Mm-hmm.
to me and my experiences, but only because they keep revealing themselves and inspiring more curiosity.
Right.
That's what really kind of moves me in that
Yeah.
way.
As you have experienced so much, and through the world of experience and different lenses and people coming in and out and studies, we're able to look at things from a different perspective, and that gives us a whole better understanding of self, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, a big part of my research is on worldview, and it's
Mm.
becoming and very much around linguistics, right? So the conceptual frameworks that we live in, from, and through, mostly which are unconscious, make up our
Yeah.
worldviewing, right, and our
Yeah.
perspective taking. And I'm fascinated by different perspectives, and I'm very fond of saying, especially as a consequence of my own research, is that we may share the same language, but that doesn't mean we share the same meaning. Because
Mm.
worldview is linguistically, worldview has been, if you speak this language, you have one worldview. This language, you have another worldview. But the truth of the matter is, we could be speaking the same exact language and not be
Right.
talking about the same thing in the same way.
Absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the most interesting things to me, especially as a therapist.
Yes.
And one of my favorite quotes as a consequence of all of this is the African quote, which says, "A fish is the last to know it's in water." And when it comes to our worldview, we're the last to know that we're actually living in one.
Mm.
And so it's great when coaches are talking about, what are you going to do about the future? And, what are you going to do about the past from a psychotherapeutic point of view? But you don't know really what you're living in, from, and through. And that's actually determining, at least the way I'm noticing it, that determines the way we experience our lives.
Right.
And so if we don't know that, there is no agency without awareness. And
Yeah.
that's another thing. That's one of the things. Those are the kinds of little things that disturb me about sort of self-help culture. Well,
Yeah.
you made choices.
Yeah.
Not always.
Yes. Exactly.
And the ascription of agency is a little violent.
Mm.
It's subtle, right?
Mm-hmm. Being in the world that you're in and that you have created around you, full of curiosity, because that's the biggest word that keeps coming to mind as you keep talking.
Yeah.
about the human species and the conscious and the subconscious mind and all that fun stuff. What is your intentions with what you have learned?
Well, as I go through the millionth iteration of my website and really thinking about relationships and sexuality, um, I'm in my own kind of transitory, transitional space with that.
Mhm.
Um, there is, I think we're due for a different kind of a relational paradigm that is able to hold greater diversity, greater gender performativity,
Yeah.
greater expansion of gender roles, um, differences in sexuality and sexual self-expression, the challenges that that offers in terms of autonomy and membership and how that dynamic is played out, challenges to social coordination dynamics.
Mhm.
And I'm returning to something that Ram Dass, Richard Alpert talked about in the 60s, which was this idea of being free together.
Right.
And what does it mean to be free together as opposed to agreements and contracts and guidelines and things that don't allow for actually the being and the becoming.
Mhm.
So that's where I am, sort of on the edge of my own work, re-looking at that paradigm, which is focused on. Ken Wilber talks about it in a way that I like and I don't like, but he talks about the notions of waking up, cleaning up, growing up, and showing up.
Right.
Right. So,
Okay.
um, but these are not things one can willfully force.
Right.
These are aspects of that one can actually nurture, right,
Right.
and tend
Yes.
to, and be with, and what happens when a shared relational space moves back to what Buber called the I thou rather than the I it, right?
Mhm.
What happens when we start thinking about the other and our mutual spiritual liberation in the context of
Mhm.
shared relational space?
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
happens when we stop when we recognize our willfulness, our egoic desires? Do we continue to force the other to love us the way that we want to be loved, or do we
Yes.
begin to recognize who the other person is and what I would like and may not be able to get from this person,
Right.
and still recognize what I am getting from this person? And perhaps there's something about a distributed love life that might be more useful here. So I don't know. That's where I'm leaning. If you're
Mhm.
asking me what I'm leaning into,
Mhm.
that's what I'm actually leaning into.
Yeah.
Really looking at relationships as, relationships within relationship.
Yeah.
Right? We talk about relationships like they're like I have a relationship. It's like it's a monolith,
Right.
and that not in the course of my experience, I'm not experiencing all sorts of different relationships. One
Mhm.
moment in this way, another moment in that way. So that's kind of where I'm leaning in terms of my work.
So then, do you also draw a parallel between that being in your work, but also being in you?
Absolutely, absolutely. When it comes to my own relationships, when I encounter my expectations, right, because we're not conscious of these things, right?
Right.
When we talk about liminalities or transitions or transitional spaces, that's our whole life. It's one big transitional space. There are little moments, little pockets of, oh, okay, I can rest here for a moment.
Mhm.
But then you
Mhm.
encounter something else.
That's right.
And what do you do when you encounter that between what you know and what
Yeah.
you're coming into contact with?
Yeah.
Um, so that is very much how I operate in my own life and in my own relationships.
What a beautiful conversation, Eric. Delving into so many different realms and so many different corners and landscapes and hills and valleys of emotions of who we are
Mm.
as humans. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yes, this is delightful.
Thank you so much, Eric.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm Naranjan, and you've been listening to Master of Your Crafts podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review, and join me next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.